The transport ship had no windows. James Okafor had noticed this immediately when the Galactic Council's envoys arrived at his farm in the pre-dawn dark, their sleek silver vessel hovering 6 inches above his sorghum field like a polite guest trying not to crush the grass. They had explained, through a translation node, the size and approximate warmth of a poker chip, that the windowless design was standard protocol. Interstellar distances, they said, had a way of disturbing unacclimated biological minds. James had looked at the 3 envoys, 2 of them vaguely insectoid, one resembling a large, dignified cloud, and decided not to push the point. He had packed a thermos of tea, his leather-worn field notebook, and the small laminated photograph of his grandmother that lived in the breast pocket of every jacket he owned. Then he had climbed aboard. That had been 4 days ago, by his watch. He spent the transit doing what he always did when he had nothing useful to accomplish, he thought. He thought about the soil composition of the farm's northern quadrant, which had been fighting him for 3 seasons. He thought about the modified cowpea varieties he'd been crossing, patient work that wouldn't bear results for another 2 years at minimum. And he thought, with increasing frequency, about the briefing documents the Cloud Envoy, who had introduced itself as Voss of the Seventh Resonance, which James had immediately shortened to Voss in his notebook, had provided him on the 2nd day of travel. The documents described a crisis of a scale James's mind kept sliding off of, like a hand trying to grip wet glass. Across the known galaxy, a phrase that still made him quietly dizzy every time he read it, an atmospheric phenomenon the Council scientists called the hollowing was devouring moisture from planetary systems at a rate that defied every model they had built to explain it. It had begun, according to Voss, some 6 galactic cycles ago, first touching the outer agricultural worlds of the Sci-Fi Confederacy, then spreading inward with the patient inevitability of a tide. 73 civilizations. 411 inhabited worlds. Every one of them now watching their soil crack and their crops fail in slow, terrible sequence. The Council had tried everything their combined science could offer. Atmospheric seeding. Synthetic hydrological systems. Emergency food synthesis networks that covered 12 worlds simultaneously. None of it was enough. The hollowing took whatever they gave and kept moving. And then someone had thought to look at Earth. James read this section of the briefing 3 times. Earth, the documents noted in careful, bureaucratic language, had been classified by the Galactic Council under Tier 7 of the Civilizational Registry, primitive agricultural society, pre-interstellar, of limited strategic importance, noted primarily as a source of genetic biodiversity. It had been monitored for roughly 2,000 years, as the Council measured time, with no active intervention and no formal contact. The monitoring had been, by all Council standards, routine. But Earth's agricultural record was not routine. What the Council's analysts had found, buried in centuries of passive data collection, was this: humans had spent 10,000 years failing. Failing comprehensively, repeatedly, and with a kind of dogged creativity that no other civilization in the Galactic Registry had quite matched. Drought had come for them, again and again, in the Fertile Crescent, in the Indus Valley, in the great farming civilizations of West Africa and Mesoamerica and China, and every time, some cluster of humans had found a way to save something. A seed cache. An irrigation technique. A variety of grain that could survive on almost nothing. They had not done this elegantly. They had done it desperately, generation after generation, preserving knowledge the way people preserve things when they understand, bone deep, that it might be the last of its kind. The Council wanted that knowledge. More specifically, they had identified 17 plant varieties from Earth's agricultural history, strains that James and his team had spent the last decade selectively breeding and restoring at the International Seed Preservation Project in northern Nigeria, as the only known species with the cellular architecture to potentially survive the hollowing's atmospheric chemistry. 17 varieties. Some of them barely holding on, populations in the thousands. All of them sitting in carefully temperature-controlled vaults on a farm outside Kano that most of the world had never heard of. The Cloud was running out of time. The Council was out of options. And James Okafor, 47 years old, third-generation farmer, former agricultural extension officer, current director of a seed bank that operated on a budget that made him cry softly once a year during fiscal review, James was the person who knew those seeds best. He finished the briefing document, set it on the floor beside his bunk, and lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the ship move through space. Then he opened his notebook and began to write. The council chamber was not what he had expected, which was foolish of him, he supposed, since he'd had no template for this whatsoever. He had perhaps imagined something vaguely parliamentary, something with rows of seats and procedural gravity. What he got instead was a space that felt like being inside a thought, vast and non-Euclidean in a way that didn't disturb him exactly but that made his inner ear quietly file a protest. The ceiling was not a ceiling. The floor was a surface. The distinction felt philosophically important but practically manageable. There were 31 council representatives present. He had been given a document listing them, with phonetic pronunciations of their names and brief cultural notes, which he had studied carefully during the last 6 hours of transit. Voss had been kind enough to quiz him. He had gotten 7 of the names right on the first try, which Voss said was impressive for a Tier 7 representative, and which James thought sounded like being told you were surprisingly good at walking for someone who usually crawled. The council's presiding voice, a title, not a person, though the being who held it appeared roughly person-shaped if you didn't look at the edges, was called Meridian of Long Consequence. It spoke first. James Okafor. The translation came a half-second after, the node at his collar warming slightly. Representative of Earth's Agricultural Archive. The council thanks you for attending. Thank you for the invitation, James said. He had decided, on about day 2 of the transit, that he was going to be unfailingly polite. Not deferential, he'd thought about that carefully and decided against it, but genuinely polite, the way his grandmother had been polite, as a form of armor, and also because she actually believed in it. You have reviewed the briefing materials. I have. Then you understand the situation. The Council requires the genetic and cultivation data associated with the 17 varieties identified in Annex C of those materials. In exchange, Earth will receive Category 4 humanitarian assistance, food synthesis technology, atmospheric stabilization for your northern agricultural regions, and provisional observer status in the Outer Council proceedings. James let a brief silence pass. Around the chamber, 31 representatives observed him with organs that served various sensory functions, none of which were quite eyes. That's a generous offer, he said. It is, Meridian agreed. I'm going to decline it. The silence that followed this was of an entirely different quality. Meridian's edges moved in a way that the cultural briefing had listed under the heading Expression of Controlled Displeasure. Around the chamber, James noticed several representatives performing their own species-specific versions of the same general emotion. The insectoid envoy to his left, Councillor Thriss of the Sci-Fi Confederacy, one of the civilizations most immediately at risk, had gone very, very still. You decline, Meridian said. The translation node rendered the word with careful neutrality. For now, James said. I'd like to make a counter-proposal. You are a representative of a Tier 7 civilization. This came from a different part of the chamber, Councillor Firemensin Standing, who the briefing notes had described as the Council's senior authority on civilizational classification. The translation rendered the voice with a texture like polished stone. Your world has not achieved interstellar travel. You have not unified your governing structures. Your species still disputes basic empirical facts among itself. You are here because we require a specific resource. That is the entirety of your position in this chamber. James nodded slowly. I understand that's how the Council sees it, he said. Can I ask a question before I present my counter-proposal? A pause. Proceed. How many of your civilizations have independently rediscovered agricultural techniques after a collapse event? He kept his voice genuinely curious, not combative. He had his notebook open in his lap, pen uncapped. I'm thinking specifically of soil microbial rebalancing, dry farming terracing, or seed viability preservation over generational timescales. I ask because it's relevant to what I want to discuss. Another silence, this one with a different texture. Thriss moved. The Serathai have records of 2 such instances, the councillor said, its voice careful. Both partial. Both with significant loss of baseline data. 17, said a voice James hadn't heard yet, from a representative near the back, a being that looked approximately like a slowly rotating geometric shape. James checked his list. Councillor AEM of the Oluan Compact. 17 civilizations in the current council have experienced at least one agricultural knowledge collapse in their recorded histories. And in how many of those cases, James said, was the knowledge fully recovered? The pause before the answer told him everything he needed to know before the answer came. 3, AEM said. Right. James wrote something in his notebook. Here's my counter-proposal. He had written it out longhand on the 3rd day of transit, revised it twice, and then read it aloud to Voss, who had been quiet for a long time afterward. He presented it now the same way he presented anything important, calmly, in order, without apology. Full sovereign recognition of Earth as a peer civilization, retroactive to the date of First Council monitoring. Permanent seats for 2 Earth representatives on the Council's inner assembly, not observer status but full voting membership. A public statement, broadcast to every inhabited world in the Council's communication network, acknowledging that Earth's agricultural knowledge had been developed independently by a Tier 7 civilization and that this knowledge was being shared by Earth's free choice, as an act of generosity between equals. He stopped speaking. The chamber processed this. "You are a farmer," Meridian said eventually. "Among other things, yes. Your civilization has not earned." "My civilization," James said, gently, "developed the only agricultural knowledge base that can save yours. Whatever system you use to assess earning might need a small recalibration." He let that land. "I'm not asking you to pretend we're something we're not. We don't have interstellar travel. We haven't unified our governments. Some of us still argue about whether the planet is the age science says it is, which I personally find exhausting. I know what we are. I'm asking you to accurately account for what we've done. And if we refuse your terms?" Firemen in standing asked. James clicked his pen closed and set it in the spine of his notebook. "Then I go home," he said. "And I'm sorry, I genuinely am, because I know what that means for the worlds that are already in crisis. I don't want that. But I can't give you what you need on terms that treat my civilization as a warehouse you happen to find useful." "You would allow billions to suffer," Farr said, "over a matter of political status." "You would allow billions to suffer," James replied, "rather than say thank you to a farmer." He paused. "I don't think either of us wants to be the one who made that choice. So let's find a way not to make it." The recess lasted 9 hours. James spent it in a small waiting chamber with Voss, who materialized a surface that served adequately as a chair and provided something warm in a container. James drank it without asking what it was. It tasted approximately like ginger and something else, something bright and slightly electric. He decided he liked it. "They're going to agree," Voss said, around the 4th hour. "Maybe. The mathematics are not subtle. The cost of your demands against the cost of the hollowing continuing. It's not mathematics for them right now," James said. "It's pride. That takes time." He looked at the photograph of his grandmother, which he'd placed on the surface beside his container. A woman in her 70s, laughing at something off camera, standing in a field of millet that came up to her waist. She had kept a seed collection of her own, nothing scientific, nothing systematic, just an old woman saving what she thought was worth saving. Some of those varieties were in his vaults now. "My grandmother used to say that the people hardest to convince aren't the ones who don't understand. It's the ones who understand perfectly well but need time to let their dignity catch up." Voss was quiet for a moment. "What was her name?" "Adiz. She went by Ada." "She sounds wise." "She was also terrifying," James said, with real feeling. "Absolute force of nature. She once argued a government agricultural inspector into reversing a land use decision by feeding him lunch and then talking to him for 3 hours. The man left apologizing." Voss's form shifted in a way James had come to associate with amusement. "You learned from her." "I learned everything from her," James said. "Including that you never negotiate on an empty stomach, which is why I'm very glad this," he raised the container slightly, "exists." The second session began with Meridian presenting a counteroffer. Partial recognition. An enhanced observer role. A joint statement of cooperation, language to be mutually agreed upon. James listened to all of it with genuine attention, and then he said, pleasantly, "No." Thriss spoke then, unexpectedly. "Councillor Okafor." The title was not one James held. Thriss had added it without ceremony, as if adjusting a small but important fact. "My world. The second world of the Sci-Fi system. It has a name. It is called Sereth Prime by outsiders, but we call it Vel. It has 3 billion people. Its growing season failed entirely 2 cycles ago. Its food reserves will last." A pause, something in Thriss's voice that the translation node rendered faithfully, the sound of someone pushing something painful into words. 14 of your months." The chamber was very quiet. "I know," James said. He held Thriss's gaze, or what passed for gaze, the compound optical structures oriented toward him with an intensity that needed no translation. "I'm sorry. I know that's not enough to say, but I am. There are people on my world who are hungry right now, too. There have always been. I've spent my career trying to stop it. I understand, at a level I wish I didn't, what those 14 months mean." He set his hands flat on the notebook in front of him. "Here's what I need you to understand. If I hand over this knowledge on your terms, in 50 years, When something else goes wrong, some other crisis you didn't model for, on some other world you haven't prioritized, whoever comes to you from that world asking for help will be told what you're telling me now. That their status isn't high enough. That they haven't earned it. That they should be grateful for what you offer. And they'll hand over whatever they have, and it will be called assistance, and no one will ever say it was anything else. He paused. I'm not negotiating for Earth alone. I'm establishing what the terms of this interaction look like going forward. AM, the geometric shape, slowly rotating, spoke. This is a civilization ally's significant claim. Yes, James agreed. You are prepared to defend it. I've been defending it for 4 days. I intend to keep going. The third recess lasted 6 hours. The fourth session lasted 20 minutes. When Meridian announced the Council's agreement to all 3 terms, full recognition, permanent seats, public broadcast, the Chamber's reaction was not what James would have called celebratory. It was quieter than that. Something in the atmosphere, the actual physical atmosphere of that vast non-Euclidean space, seemed to shift its weight. Thriss said nothing. But the Councillor's form moved in a way James had not seen before, and when he checked his briefing notes later, he found the gesture listed under Acknowledgement of Debt. The agreement took 11 more days to finalize. James spent most of them in working sessions with the Council's agricultural science teams, and these were, honestly, the days he would remember most. Not the negotiation, though that would be what history recorded, but the work. Sitting with scientists from 7 different civilizations, none of them with faces he could fully read, all of them looking at the same data he was looking at with the same focus hunger he felt. Cellular viability assays on the seeds. Atmospheric chemistry models for 20 different planetary environments. Germination protocols for soils that had never seen these species before. Adaptation matrices that made his head ache pleasantly, the specific ache of a problem that is hard enough to be worth solving. One scientist, from a civilization called the Ven, who appeared to be primarily made of something like coral, had been working on dry farming terracing for 30 years, trying to reconstruct techniques from incomplete records. James had pulled out his notebook on the second day and spent 6 hours going through everything he knew, watching the translation node work in real time, watching the Ven scientist absorb the information with the focused stillness of someone drinking water after a long drought. This will work, the Ven scientist said, finally. The terracing will need adaptation for your specific soil profiles, James said. And I'd want at least 2 growing cycles before we call anything a success. But yes, I think it has a real chance. A real chance. The translation rendered the Ven's tone with care. On my world, we have not had a real chance at anything in 4 cycles. James looked at the data in front of them. You have one now, he said. The broadcast was transmitted on the 32nd day, by James's watch. He was allowed to see the raw text before it went out, a statement from the full council, formal and comprehensive in the way only bureaucratic documents can be, but clear in its substance. Earth, a world that had developed its agricultural knowledge without interstellar assistance over 10,000 years of independent effort, was sharing that knowledge freely, as an act of cooperation between recognized equal civilizations. He read it twice. He thought about what it would mean for the next researcher from a Tier 7 world who found themselves in a council chamber needing something. Maybe something. Maybe not enough. But something. On the 33rd day, he went home. The ship had windows on the return journey. Voss had arranged it. James sat at one of them for a long time as they approached Earth, watching the planet resolve from a concept into a thing you could see. The blue that he knew was ocean, the brown and green that was everywhere people had planted things and fought over water and dug into soil with their hands for thousands of years, stubborn and foolish and occasionally brilliant, losing ground and recovering, losing again, recovering again. His grandmother had told him once, when he was very young, about a variety of cowpea that had nearly been lost during a drought when she was a child. A single farmer in her village had kept seeds in a clay pot buried under his house, not for any strategic reason, just because he couldn't bring himself to throw them away. That farmer had died before the drought ended. But his daughter had found the pot, and the seeds had been viable, and now that variety was in James's vault, crossbred and stabilized and multiplied by several thousand%. You don't always know what you're saving, his grandmother had said. You save it anyway. James pressed his palm against the window glass. The planet below him was very blue. He thought about 17 seed varieties sitting in a temperature-controlled vault outside Kano. He thought about soil composition and germination protocols and the long, patient work of crossbreeding, the work that didn't show results for years. He thought about Vel and its 14 months, and Thriss's hands moving in the gesture his briefing notes described as acknowledgement of debt. He thought about what it meant that humans had needed to be desperate enough, often enough, for long enough, that they had built up, without knowing they were doing it, the only knowledge in a galaxy that could save it. There was something in that. He wasn't sure it was comfort, exactly. But it was something. He opened his notebook to a clean page and began to write up the first of the agricultural adaptation protocols, starting with Vel and the Sci-Fi system, starting with Thrissa's 14 months. He wrote in the careful, precise way his grandmother had taught him to document things, not because you assumed anyone would read it, but because you assumed someone might need it. You save it anyway. Outside the window, Earth grew slowly larger, patient and blue and, for the first time in its 10,000-year agricultural history, formally recognized by the rest of the universe as something more than a footnote. It was, James thought, a decent start. He kept writing. This story was brought to you by HSY Stories. Subscribe to our channel and be the first to experience every new story.